Greetings. My name is Brogan Joe Murphy. I am. This class is this Zoom class is on the subject of the history of portraiture in art. A portrait is a presence of an individual seen through time. It's a representation of a human being at a specific place in time in history. The frame that surrounds the portrait I like to see as a window frame. And in a way, you get to travel back in time to see that person looking back at you through the eyes of an artist who is recording. The expression of a portrait can convey many different things. It can convey status, sometimes power, sometimes spirituality. It's often motivated by, in the terms of the sitter, the person who's having the portrait done, a desire to leave something behind, a record that they were there. Oftentimes, to have something survive our inevitable demise. In the earliest forms of portraiture that we have, oftentimes are found in graves because they are preserved. Very few portraits from antiquity survive because of that, because of the elements, because of war, pestilence, many, many things, both natural and unnatural disaster that have destroyed art through time. But the art that is buried in the ground often is preserved by the very nature of how it is saved. The oldest that I'm aware of is supposedly from 25,000 BC, a portrait in our first slide here. It was discovered in a cave in, I'm sure I'm butchering this pronunciation of this town in France, but Angoulême, Angoulême, I don't know. But it was discovered in 2006. It's generous to suggest it's a portrait, but perhaps in a very primitive way it was intended as such. You can somewhat make out the nose and eyes and the general features of a face, but it also could be a Rorschach test. Someone is seeing something that maybe isn't really there. But moving on, we to the next slide, we start to see the best preserved portraits of antiquity are often sculptures. Sometimes, especially in Egypt, in the early days of Egypt, had perfected the art of burial, and inside these tombs, they retain many of the things that were important in the person's life, and oftentimes a representation of what they looked like. These are often idealized, excluding their imperfect qualities and trying to keep preserve an image. The idea was that the statue of a person was believed to be a permanent abode for their spirit and guaranteed them eternal life after death. Next slide. The idealism of ancient Egyptian portraiture was by choice, not by lack of talent. This is evident in the realistic depiction of birds and animals. Here we have one of the oldest known portraits in the picture to the left. It's the dwarf Seneb, Seneb, and his family, 4,000 years before the invention of photography. To the right, you see another example of a married couple, and again, probably idealized to some degree. These sculptures, because they were buried, the color and the form has been retained through time. Most paintings did not survive as well as sculpture, but some portraits buried with the subjects in the subject's tomb have survived. In the next slide, you see several of these ancient portraits, and some of these appear to be quite realistic. Next slide. In China, the artists from the Han Dynasty, about 200 years BC, all the way up through the Tang Dynasty, that's Tang, which was between 618 and 906 AD. They were mostly known for the painting of the human figure, but much of what we know of early Chinese figure painting and portraiture comes again from burial sites, where the paintings were preserved on silk banners, lacquered objects, and tomb walls. Here we have several examples of portraitures done in China on tomb walls. Portraiture was actually something of a latecomer to Chinese art. It came more than a millennium after the beginnings of Chinese artistic expression. During the Tang Dynasty, artists depicted the splendor of court life in paintings of emperors, palace ladies, and imperial horses. Chinese art was primarily concerned with illustration, landscape, and calligraphy. Their portraits tended to be more two-dimensional, without the modeling and attention to light source and perspective that can be found in Western art. Next slide. And here we have some portraits of the Greeks.
Joe, hang on 1 second. I'm sorry. Hang on.
Take your time. Should be 3 Greek sculptures in the next slide.
There we go. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure that your mic was working properly, but it is. It's good.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
My lovely lilting voice to be for posterity. Okay, here we have 3 examples of ancient Greek portraiture. In the center, we have a portrait of Sophocles. Classic Greek art was the beginning and the change of the art of portraiture. The Greeks created sculptures that were 3-dimensional with anatomical accuracy and alive with movement. As you can see, the portrait of Sophocles, he appears to be grasping at his toga, and his arm and his left arm crooked in a pose, but very lifelike and very realistic. On the left, you have a bust of it, again, it appeared to be a very realistic bust, and with and not idealized. As time passed, the Greek artists continued to move more and more towards realism. The ideal of individualized portraiture also continued to develop, and portraits began to contain even more personality. The next slide shows an example of a painted portrait that has survived from ancient Greece. Now, there are far fewer of these that have survived, and again, mostly in either in tombs or in places that were buried by a catastrophe, such as like the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, where it buried entire towns, encased in the ash from the volcanic ash, and it preserved some representations of paintings. Contemporary descriptions of paintings suggest a high degree of realism. One writer actually remarked that the grapes on one fresco were so realistic that the birds would attempt to eat them. In the next slide, we see an example of Roman portraiture through sculpture. Now, we're used to seeing sculptures from ancient Greece and Rome as being these monochronistic, off-white carved marbles, but what we don't see is what they actually did at the time, which was to paint these sculptures. So even though by the time many years had passed, the paint had long since been wiped off by weather and the elements, as you see here in this sculpture of Augustus Caesar, it shows what it might have looked like at the time in which it was done. Roman portraiture was probably one of the most significant periods in the development of portrait art. It continued in Rome for almost 5 centuries. As you can see in the next slide, Roman portraiture is characterized by unusual realism. Some busts even show clinical signs of aging, warts, and all. In the Republic, public officials commissioned portrait busts that reflected just about every wrinkle and imperfection of the skin. Heroic full-length statues were often composed of generic bodies onto which the realistic portrait head was attached. So some of these statues, with all the incredible musculature of the sculpture, suggest a level of health that probably wasn't true for some of these officials. Roman funerary art also includes many portraits. In the next slide, you see a couple, and on the left and on the right, these were found in the ill-fated city of Pompeii, that again was preserved by the volcanic ash that buried the city after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. When you look at the painting to the right, it's a highly realistic portrait, and one cannot help but feel like you are looking back thousands and thousands of years at another person who's looking at you. I mean, it's quite amazing. And of course, these people most likely died along with everyone else in Pompeii. But again, their image has been preserved because of how everything ended. When we leave the ancient world, in the next slides, we start to see portraits from the Italian Renaissance. The Dark Ages that followed the fall of ancient Rome and the Black Plague that decimated Europe, much of art was relegated to what was being done in monasteries by monks, illustrating religious texts And very little of portraiture was being done during this period, and it was revived in the Italian Renaissance in the 15th century. It was also part of a larger cultural phenomena of individual accomplishment. You start to see people of wealth wanting to commission their paintings of themselves. With the growth of trade between different city-states in Italy and throughout Western Europe, we see a new emphasis on self-governing and the political units of Italy, and it resulted in a sizable number of wealthy and powerful individuals who wanted to record their features for posterity. The two paintings you see here, on the left is the Doge by Giovanni Bellini, painted in 1501. The Doge was a title. It's kind of like president, I guess, for the time, but it was Venice. And to the right, another painting from Venice by the great artist Titian, also known as, real name was Tiziano Vecellio, but everyone knows him as Titian. He was possibly one of the most influential portrait artists of this time period, because his paintings found their way into collections in many of the courthouses or the palaces of Europe at the time. The next slide shows two other portraits. One on the left is by Sandro Botticelli, painted in 1485. And here again, you see a very three-dimensional view where you have a light source with shadow on one side and light on the other, and a very plastic or three-dimensional. You get a sense of their weight, their volume, that they fill a space. And you also get a sense of individuality. They're not idealized. They are intended to look, this is more than likely, given the competence of the artists, more than likely what they looked like. And to the right, painted in 1515, is a portrait by Raphael Sanza of Bingo Altviti, a beautiful portrait, very sensitively rendered, with attention to the texture of the hair, the delicacy, the fineness, and the modeling, the very soft modeling of the face. Again, very three-dimensional. Portrait could function as a way of announcing one's piety, one's virtue, one's learning or prosperity, or even one's inner soul. The Italian Renaissance, for the first time in history, saw a notable increase in portraits of women. Northern Italians excelled in the portraits of beautiful women dressed in exquisite, costly clothing. In the next slide, we see two examples of such portraits. To the left, we have a young Italian woman dressed in very refined clothes. The painting is titled The Magdalene. Essentially, the model is intended to be Mary Magdalene, but is clearly not a Jew, but an Italian who is posed here. A very realistic portrait with a great attention to detail, possibly commissioned by somebody. It might have been someone's wife, and they wanted her portrayed as the Magdalene for some reason. And to the right is possibly one of the most famous portraits of history, is Lisa del Giocondo by Leonardo da Vinci, known as the Mona Lisa. Now, Leonardo began this painting in 1503, and he kept the painting with him when he left Italy and went to France to uh, uh, paint in the court of the King of France. And it's likely, given the modeling that he was known for, Leonardo da Vinci, that his the painting probably long since stopped being a painting of this particular woman. His inclusion of the landscape in the background is a new addition to portraiture that you did not see in prior years. Here we have a person set in a context, in a scene. The introduction of landscapes complemented, sometimes symbolically and sometimes just aesthetically, the portrait that was being painted. Now, as we move on to the next slide, we begin to see the Renaissance as expressed further north with the Flemish and the Dutch. And here we have on the, I'm sorry, Ryan, do you have 2 pictures or 4 in this slide?
I have 2.
Okay. In the first slide, we have 2 paintings by the Flemish painter Jan van Eyck. On the left, it's called, is a painting, I believe it's called The Wedding. And it's 2 patrons. Ironically, the detail of this painting is phenomenal, and I take it further in the next slide. On the right is probably one of the first known self-portraits by Jan van Eyck. This is the actual artist. It's often called the man in the red turban. But again, the modeling, the detail from the, if one gets close, the beard stubble of the sitter. In the next slide, you see details from it's called the Arnolfini wedding portrait, painted in 1434. And you actually, in the reflection in the mirror on the wall behind the 2 portraits is a reflection of actual people entering the room that the couple are in. And to the right is you will see details of the chandelier. Phenomenal attention to all of these elements. Again, included in portraits to signify often wealth, status, and to some degree their spiritual leanings. Also, this is something new that has been introduced into portraiture, and it began in Italy, but it was continued with the Flemish, and that is the use of oil painting. Often portraits before this time were done in what's called gouache, or an opaque watercolor. But once they introduced oil, the slow drying of the oil allowed for greater degree of modeling and a greater degree of detail. And this is what you see in the Flemish portraits. Now, the Dutch painting represents the Low Countries and their response to the Italians. In the next slide, we see one of the greatest portrait painters of history, and this is Rembrandt van Rijn. And Italian painting, again, through trade, found its way into Antwerp, which became an important artistic center in the region. And we know a lot about Rembrandt in terms of his influences because at a certain point in his career, kind of mid to early or late part of his career, Rembrandt suffered financial downturns and was able, there was a bankruptcy, and was a great amount of detail about the objects that were taken and sold because of his bankruptcy. Among them were a number of paintings from Italy, including in his private collection, a Raphael. So the influence of the Italians was being spread throughout Europe, again, through trade. To the left, you see a Rembrandt self-portrait, and to the right, one of his early portraits painted in 1639. Rembrandt was known for his self-portraits because he painted them throughout his life, from the time he was a teenager all the way until just years before he died. His early work, and if you look at the painting to the right, you see the phenomenal detail that he would give to a painting. The incredible ornamentation of the dress, the lace, the brocade, it is quite remarkable. Rembrandt, to some degree, was perhaps showing off his skills, but also it was very much in demand at the time, and he was very much in demand as a portrait painter. In the next slide, you see two different types of portrait that also had been introduced at this time that didn't happen before this. And this is the idea of group portraits. On the left, is a painting called The Syndics of the Draper Guild. This was painted in 1662. And here we have a group of people, all part of the same guild or essentially a business organization. And they appear as if someone had entered a room, and one man is starting to stand, and all attention is focused on the viewer of the painting entering the room and seeing these people. Rembrandt had a phenomenal ability to create a sense of presence and drama in his composition and in his lighting. His lighting was probably influenced by the work of the Italian painter Caravaggio, who introduced the concept of chiaroscuro. Now, chiaroscuro is an artistic term. It's Italian. It's combining the words chiaro and scuro, chiaro for light and scuro for darkness. And it was a way of creating drama through the use of light and darkness. And here in these two paintings, you see his consummate skill at creating drama and focus of a painting by having the light appear in a certain direction, focusing your eyes. Like on the painting to the left, you immediately look at the man starting to stand up because your eyes are drawn to that area because of the light hitting the tablecloth. To the right, you have one of his most famous works called The Night Watch, painted in 1642. The Night Watch, again, also creates the same drama by having much of the paintings immersed in darkness and certain individuals highlighted by the direction that the light takes place. Again, these are portraits. If you look closely at the Night Watch, all of the multiple people in the painting are individual portraits, including at Rembrandt even includes himself and probably Saskia, his wife at the time, into the portrait also, using them as models for some of the characters. But the main features of the main people that had commissioned the work are probably painted through individual sittings by individual painters, individual people. Many artists worked for European courts, adopting the Italian models and incorporating them into their own artistic language. Dutch and Flemish painters were also instrumental in establishing new subjects such as landscape painting and genre painting. In the next slide, we see another great Dutch painter, the painter John Vermeer. Vermeer is often cited as one of the earliest impressionists. I know most people think of Impressionism as being brightly colored, heavily painted, painted in big, bright colors and little splotches and not that much detail, but mostly known for color. But really, Impressionism is not so much a technique of painting, but a perspective of the artist. The Impressionist tries to paint a scene as it appears to him visually and is not concerned with great detail, but more as a focus of what the artist sees in front of him, trying to paint faithfully the colors and the light and how it bathes the figure that's being painted. On the left, the woman with the red hat, you see that in the shadows under the hat, there's not a great deal of detail, only in the areas where the light appears that you see more detail. And you also see an almost photographic attention to focus. This is partly due to the method that Vermeer used to paint, which was the device called a camera obscura. Now, a camera obscura was essentially a box in which a lens would see the image, invert it, and shine literally a reflected version of what was the artist was looking at onto his canvas, so that he could literally paint in a way like copying a photograph, except in this sense, he was copying the image being projected. The artist would immerse themselves under a drape in total darkness. So when the light came in, it would be cast onto the canvas. They could do their drawing and build up the painting from that. No doubt, making ample use of the actual model that's in front of him, but the focus that you see is very similar to the type of focus that a camera would give you, a limited focal range and driving you to see what the artist wanted you to see. And the right, Vermeer does an actual portrait of most likely a servant or someone in his household. And this, again, a very famous painting by Vermeer called the Girl with the Pearl Earring. And here, again, the areas where the most detail is are the areas of light, and the areas of darkness and shadow, you have less focus. The sharpest focus is on the reflection in the eyes and in the pearl. Again, drawing you into the painting and focusing on what the artist considers to be the most important part of the painting. So in a way, Vermeer also influenced many other painters, but his work shows that this idea of focus, the idea of seeing that the way the human eye is that when you look at something, only what you're looking at is in focus. Everything else is not as focused. And so rather than paint everything with the same level of detail, you basically are painting the things that are most important, putting those in focus and leaving the rest out of focus. Moving on to the next slide, we see again the Italian Renaissance spread to Spain. And much of the influence of art in Spain and the art of Italy has been the result of what was done by Charles I, the King of Spain. He was predisposed to this new art, paradoxically called the Old Way, giving a homage to classical antiquity, meaning that it was new art, but it was a renaissance. It was a rebirth of the art of antiquity, the detail and the forms of antiquity. His direct patronage, Charles I's patronage of the artist Titian, had brought works from Italy into the Spanish court and had a great influence on the work of the painter Diego Velasquez. In these first two examples, on the left, you have a traditional Renaissance portrait of a wealthy woman, or her dress being ornamented with jewels and brocade and silks and velvets. Again, great detail, not much spiritual, not much, I don't necessarily feel like you get the character of the woman, more or less her trappings and her station. And to the right, you see a portrait by the painter El Greco, which stood for the Greek, and he was an expatriate working in Spain, and was known by most to be the father of the Mannerist movement. In the next slide, we see the work of Diego Velasquez, possibly the greatest portrait artist of in Spanish ever in Spain. And we have here two examples of his work. On the left, a self-portrait of the artist, and to the right, a portrait of Juan Pareja, painted in 1650. Here you also see the influence of chiaroscuro, the drama of the light and dark. And of course, we also must remember that all of the portraiture that you're seeing has to have been painted under natural light, and most of the interiors of these buildings were lit by candlelight. So darkness was a very common interior of this time period. So it's not unusual to see so much darkness surrounding the figures. Moving on to the next slide, again, still concentrating on the Renaissance, we have the portraits of England. On the left, we have a portrait by Nicholas Hillyard. The painting on the right is of Queen Elizabeth I of the left, and on the left, someone of the landed aristocracy. Again, typical of the time period, much ornamentation on the clothing, on the fabrics, on the jewels, on the display of wealth and power. On the left, you see more of the power just from the pose. And on the right, of course, the Queen of England, one would expect the trappings of the monarchy. Portraiture played a dominant role in England since the Renaissance because of a relatively stable monarchy and with a powerful landed aristocracy. It provided much continuity and patronage of artists. Ironically, one of the most famous portrait artists of England was not English at all. In the next slide, we see two portraits by Hans Holbein the Younger. Hans Holbein was German, but in the 1620s to the 1650s, spent much of his time in England painting some of the most notable people of English history. Here we have two of his most famous portraits. On the left, the portrait of Sir Thomas More, who was at the time when the portrait was done, Chancellor of England. And to the right, Henry VIII. Now, again, these portraits have phenomenal amount of detail. Holbein was extremely skillful at painting the various textures. On the left, you see Sir Thomas More with the fur collar, the velvet sleeves, the paper, the gold medallion around his neck, the wood chair that he rests his hand on, and the curtain in the backdrop. All of these different textures, as well as the texture of the skin, the beard stubble. But here you also get a little bit more of the inner representation, the spiritual representation. Thomas More being a very important man in the history of England. And to the right, you have King Henry VIII. Again, seen through a frame, these are windows in time. These are a view of people who lived and held a powerful position in the history of the world. Without these portraits, we would only be able to surmise who and what they were, but the portraits convey it. If we look at the painting of Henry VIII, the detail on the garment is remarkable. And it does show what one would expect to see in that time period and with the wealth and trappings of power. During the reign of Henry VIII, Holbein painted many portraits, a number of portraits of the King of England, as well as any of the ministers. By 1526, he had unparalleled mastery of creating the illusion of the physical presence of a sitter. In the next slide, you see the next iteration of English portraiture, again, not by an Englishman, by a painter named Van Eyck, who was a student of Jean-Paul Rubens, the great Flemish master. Here we have a portrait of Charles I, and an unusual presentation showing three sides of the same sitter, all heads, ironically, because Charles I was the first monarch of, and I believe the last, of England who was executed and was beheaded as a result of the Civil War led by Oliver Cromwell. At the time that he was deposed and beheaded, the monarchy was dissolved, but later was reconstituted by Charles II, his son. So this brings us to the end of part one of the history of portraiture. In part two, we explore the self-portrait, portraiture in politics and religion, 18th to 19th century portraiture, classicism and impressionism, the influence of the invention of photography, and the 20th and 21st century portraiture, and the influence of modernism and contemporary masters. And that concludes part one.